As soon as I heard about Michael's death, I thought about the last time I spoke to him, and I've always regretted that the last time I spoke to him, he was angry on the phone. At least I always thought of him being angry on the phone that day, but the more I think of it, and the more I think about his life and the sadness of his life, I think he was wounded on the phone that day. I was at the Los Angeles Times from 1970 to 2005 as a pop critic, but my days with Michael go back even before that, which makes it seem a long time ago. He was in the Jackson 5. The Jackson 5 was the hottest young pop band in America. I was freelancing at the Times, and the editor asked me if I'd go do a story with him. And I wasn't that interested in their music. I was more interested in Dylan and people like that. But I thought it was kind of an interesting little story. So I went out to their house. It was West Hollywood or Beverly Hills at the time, around 8 o'clock. And I think the publicity person came to the door. The other brothers were all sitting there really waiting to talk. And I noticed Michael wasn't there. And I think maybe it was his mom said, I'll go get Michael, I'll go get Michael. He's probably watching those cartoons again. And so she went away and came back. And you know, he came back, he was just dressed up in a nice little outfit. He was just so cute. But you could see it was the last place he wanted to be at 8 o'clock on a Sunday night was talking to me about anything. He didn't say much, but he had to stay in the room. So the other brothers kind of told about their experiences coming from Gary, Indiana, Motown days, Diana Ross, all this stuff. And finally, maybe about 8:45, it was over with. You know, maybe 9 o'clock, the interview was over with. And I remember the first thing after that, I went around, was shaking hands with everybody in the group. And I started to shake hands. Lisa, Michael ran to the front of the line. He wanted to shake hands first. He says, now can I go watch my cartoons? And his kind of father said, all right, Michael, but only for a half hour, because he had to go to school the next day. You know? He was just the cutest thing, and he was the cutest thing on stage. He was a great little singer, great dancer, but still the history of child stars becoming adult stars was so small that I never dreamed that there would be any life after that for the Jackson 5. And in fact, through much of the 1970s, the group did just somewhat disappear, and it seemed like that they were over with. And I think that had a profound impact on Michael, the fact that he was loved by the world and then in a sense rejected. And it was even a deeper rejection that eventually I found out about. If you made a bet in 1974 that Michael Jackson would have the biggest selling record of all time, I mean, there wouldn't be a number high enough on the odds board in Las Vegas to put it there. It'd be 1,000,000 to 1. So, you know, there wasn't much thought about Michael Jackson. Then he explodes with Off the Wall. Before that, they had to leave Motown. Motown wanted to produce the music, wanted to control the music, thinking they knew best. Michael he realized he had to get away from Motown and work with other people. He had to make his music move in other directions. So he was a pretty tough young man that he actually walked away from Motown. And he got together with Quincy Jones. They made Off the Wall. It was a huge hit. The Jacksons went on tour again, 1981, sellout crowds all around the country. So that's when I got back into his life. I flew to St. Louis, rode the bus with him to Detroit. And the other brothers were so happy. It was just like it was back in that house in 1970. They were talking, eager to talk about their life, but Michael wasn't there. This time he wasn't watching cartoons, though. He was in the back of the bus, just kind of nervous, anxious, frightened almost in a way. And so at the end of the interview, just before we pulled into Detroit, I finally went back to the back of the bus and started talking to him. And you know, he was so different than the 11-year-old. Now he was now 23. He was so different. I mean, we all changed, but this was so remarked. This sweet, happy, outgoing young man was just totally withdrawn. He would look at the floor when he would talk, and I said, you know, the one thing I almost couldn't imagine him living on his own. And I said, why don't you live in your own place now? You're a big star. Why do you stay and live with your parents at home? And he said this, and I always remember. He said, oh no, I think I would die on my own. I'd be so lonely. Even at home, I'm lonely. I sit in my room and sometimes cry. It's so hard to make friends, and there are some things you can't talk to your parents or family about. I sometimes walk around the neighborhood at night just hoping to find someone to talk to, but I just end up coming home. And that's about as far as he would go, and kind of, I didn't understand why the loneliness, why the fragileness and stuff, but it was clearly he was very, very troubled at that point. even though I didn't see Michael for 4 years, I guess 3 years after that interview, I happened to be present at many of the events that were really probably the most proudest days of his life. First of all, I think it was the Pasadena Civic Auditorium on the Motown 25 special. And Michael got on the stage and he did the Moonwalk for the first time, and I was sitting in the audience and people just gasped. And I said, I didn't know if it was a trick. I wrote down in my notes, but I wasn't going to put in the paper that I didn't know how to describe the Moonwalk. I didn't know quite what it was. It was just magical. And that was Michael's favorite term, magical. He wanted to always be magical. So I called his manager the next morning before our deadline, and I asked him, I said, was it an escalator, or was it something on stage that moved, or what was that? And they said, no, that was genuinely him moving. And I really couldn't believe it. I thought there was some trick to it, but I wrote in the paper about it. The night he won the 8 Grammys, I was in the audience. He had clearly triumphed. He had declared his independence from Motown. He was on top of the world. But the fascinating thing, the thing I remember most about that was later when I started talking to him, the night after he won those Grammys. I mean, most people would take a few days and relax and bask in the. He was back in the studio working on another record that night. Isn't that amazing? So I always thought, that was the dedication. He was so driven. He was really a perfectionist. He would often complain that the people around him just wouldn't work hard enough. He was frustrated by that. He loved to be associated with famous people. It made him feel like a bigger star, and he thought the more famous people he'd be associated with, the more the public would be fascinated with him, because he was always interested in building his stardom. He knew that he wanted to be the biggest star, the biggest celebrity. But then the next thing with Michael was I was on the Victory Tour, and I spent several weekends with him on the road. And the reason that came about was he had signed a contract with Doubleday to do his autobiography. And the reason he signed it was that Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was the editor there, and he was flattered. But he didn't want to do a biography, it turned out. I mean, once I got on the road with him, I found out he wanted to do a picture book. He wanted to get all his pictures together and have maybe a caption about him, whereas she wanted a revealing book. But Michael didn't want, he thought that the less you knew about people, stars, the more you were fascinated by him. He would say to me, Elvis never did interviews, Howard Hughes didn't do interviews, and that was the framework he used. He was thinking the biggest people he could think of, and what did they do? He would study their lives. So anyway, we spent several weekends on the book. The frustration kept getting more and more because he would pick up these pictures, and he was so much against telling anything about himself. I remember we picked up a picture one time of an older man, maybe somebody looked like he was 80 or 90. I said, Michael, who is this? And he said, oh, that's my grandfather. And I said, well, let's see, what can we say about him in the caption? Did you like your grandfather? Oh, I loved him. I said, oh, great, we'll say that. And he said, no, that's too personal. And so it was really very difficult. And finally, there was a showdown. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis came out to Los Angeles to his house to kind of sit and look, well, let's discuss this book. It's not going right. And he was too nervous. He was afraid to sit. He didn't like confrontation. So he said, Bob, you talk to him, or Robert, he called me. Robert, you talk to her. And he raced upstairs in his bedroom and stayed there. And so I talked to her a few minutes and she said they were trying to think of different ways to do the book and so forth. And finally, then she went back, and I got a call from Michael's attorney. And so I stopped being involved, and they decided to go a different way. I think Doubleday kind of took over the book instead of him kind of taking over the book. The most important lesson I heard, and they would refer to over and over again, was the rejection in those years in the 70s when the Jackson 5 was no longer popular. He was 16, 17 by that time. One time he picked up, we turned over a picture, and it happened to be a picture of him at that age. And he had acne, very bad acne. This wasn't a picture that was touched up, obviously. This was a picture of some kind of home picture. He had acne. He thought his nose was way too big. Oh, look at that. That's ugly. So he turned the picture over. He kind of recoiled at that. But I kind of kept talking to him, and with the tape recorder off, he said that he would, sometimes people would, it was so bad, sometimes people would come over to the Jackson house, people who might have been around for a few years. They would look for Michael. They would walk up right to him, look him in the eye and say, where's Michael? Where's Michael? And the feeling he got, now these people might not have been like this, but they wanted the cute little Michael, and they resented that he had grown up. Who are you? You're not our Michael. You've taken our Michael away from us. And that was so damaging to him, so hurtful, that I think that was a lot of the root for him wanting to be the biggest star of all time, so no one could be like that. He would be protected by that fame. You know, there was no way people could reject him anymore. During those times on the road, we would talk about Thriller and its success, and he would say, one night he said, "Robert, the next album, it's going to be twice as many sales as Thriller." And I said, I thought he was kidding, but he wasn't. He was really serious. And I think ultimately, that drive to be number one, where the status in the charts was almost more important than the quality of the music, I think hurt him. I think the music started losing some of its heart. I think it became sounding more calculated. He was starting to do things that made it, they were more aimed at the radio. The innocence in Michael got lost in all that. And I think that was ultimately the downfall. I think that once again that stardom started slipping away, I think he became more desperate in his life. I didn't think he'd ever tour again. I didn't think he would ever make another good record. So I was very surprised when he announced these shows in London. And I was even more surprised when I saw there were 50 dates. I didn't know physically and emotionally how he could ever get through 50 dates of a show if something would go wrong. Now, I'm sure it lifted him up when he heard that he had sold 50 dates, because it showed the people there was the demand. People still loved him, but still moving forward, he had to face every day and sometime I bet you during this period when he was rehearsing for the tour, he would think, what if this doesn't work? What if the audience, if I'm not as magical as I was, at 50 I'm not the same person I was at 25. Maybe it's just, I think that must have been a terrible pull in him, the idea of, I want to get back and regain my throne, and what if I don't? What if it's a disaster? Because then there would be no coming back ever. I mean, it was all on the line in London, and he never made it to the line. He certainly felt more comfortable generally with children than he did with most adults. After one of the concerts on the Victory Tour in Los Angeles, he had a big party at one of the big hotels downtown. It was a kind of a celebration party. And several guests, famous guests, Brooke Shields came, and who he had supposed to be his friend and stuff. But he spent the whole evening in his bedroom playing pillow fighting with the kids of those stars and stuff. And never came out and Brooke Shields waited so long she finally got up. Her mother left. He felt this innocence when he was around children. They weren't going to judge him. They weren't going to reject him and stuff. They didn't have to worry about them. He was very smart and very tough when it came to negotiation, when it came to deciding what was good for his career and stuff like that. So he wasn't like this innocent person who couldn't make any decisions. He could make decisions of a certain kind. But the idea of social relationships with adults at that time in the 80s was very difficult for him. And Paul was very upset that that Michael bought the Beatles catalog, because Paul was the one who introduced him into the financial value of owning songs. And so when Michael went out and bought these songs of McCartney, Paul was very upset at him. But to Michael, it was a great business investment. Plus, it was owning a piece of history. I mean, the Beatles are the biggest thing ever, biggest group ever. And if he could own that, my Lord, what a businessman he was. It was a great purchase. I mean, it was a great value, because that thing is now worth maybe multi-million, maybe $1 billion, that catalog, and he bought it for $47,000. And I was with him at the house because I did a story on that, the background of how that was done, and he was just so happy. I mean, that was this was coming off the Victory Tour, off the Thriller album. He was just ecstatic. This was what he wanted his life to be. But sadly, somewhat after that, it was never the same. I doubt if it was ever the same. The one time you could always guarantee that Michael was happy, though, was when he was on stage. It was his sanctuary. No one could get him there. He was magical. He didn't like being seen by people when he wasn't on stage, because he didn't have the makeup on. He didn't have the props behind him. He didn't have the glove. He didn't have the uniforms. He wanted to always appear magical, and he knew he couldn't be magical without those things. I mean, just walking down the street, it's not the same person. So that's another reason that he tended to be reclusive. So you wouldn't see him very much. But I asked him about the stage one time, and he told me, actually it was in 1981 when we were on the bus to Detroit. He said, "My real goal is to fulfill God's purpose. I didn't choose to sing or dance, but that's my role and I want to do it better than anyone else. I still remember the first time I sang in kindergarten class. I sang Climb Every Mountain, and everyone got so excited. It's beautiful at the shows when people come together. It's our own little world. For that hour and a half, we try to show that there is hope and goodness. It's only when you step back outside the building that you see all the craziness. And the sad thing for Michael is that there just wasn't enough hour and a halves on stage. I had written a story the day before of a poll in the record industry. I was asking them to name the top 30 most powerful people in the music industry, the most popular people in the music industry, and Michael's name did not come up. I mean, it came up, but not in a positive sense. The executives, this was in 1995, thought his career was over. They were saying things like, he's too much hype, people have lost faith in him, the record buyers have lost faith in him. And so I put those words in the paper. So Michael called the next day. He was, I think hurt. He was wounded by this because he was a very delicate young man, and I still think of him as a young man. He was, he said, why did you put those things in the paper? Why did you put those lies in the paper? And I said, Michael, I think some of the stuff those people were saying was the truth. It might be more important for you to make a great record than a #1 record. I think you need to put more of your heart in the music again. I think you've lost some of that. And he says, no, Robert, that hurts, that hurts. And I said, I tried to tell him more, try to give him more of a pep talk because I kind of felt bad about making him feel bad. But I got halfway through my next sentence and he hung up. And that was the last time I ever heard from him. One of the things I remember most about, and one of the things I remember most fondly about Michael was that during the Victory Tour, despite the hectic route and hectic schedule, he would find time to go visit children in hospitals at night sometimes. And he would go into these rooms with kids with terminal illnesses and go over and try to talk to them and cheer them up. And it was such a tender scene that I remember his manager, Frank DeLeo, who was known as a pretty tough negotiator, would have to leave the room because he would start tearing up. And you know, I understood why he was tearing up. And so, but Michael would stand there and talk to those kids for, you know, minutes and minutes at a time. And that's the time I thought, to me, he was the strongest and the most magical. I had spent most of the day, I was doing other things, and I didn't want to listen to the radio because the NBA draft was that night. And I had TiVoed. So I drove up so I wasn't listening to radio, so I drove up about 4:30 or 5 o'clock that day. And my wife came out and said that the paper and some television radio stations were trying to get a hold of me. And I said, why? And they said, didn't you hear who died? You know, I didn't think of the great moments. I go back to the moments when he was, you know, the hospital, the time when he'd be in his room, people would be telling him how tickets were selling, the times when somehow he was in touch with that innocence of the young man I saw in 1970, when that part of him was the most visible. And I only wish that somehow in his life he had been able to find more days and weeks and months and years in which that joy was present in his life.